We're live now, I tell you that much.
All right. There we go.
Go ahead.
All right. So now that we're back, in lieu, looks like our guest wasn't able to make it. So in lieu of that, we're gonna have a conversation about something that Gio and I see a little bit differently, but we're gonna have the conversation cordially. So we're gonna talk about foreign policy. I think Gio, and if you guys weren't able to see it before, Gio was saying he tends a little bit more on the isolationist side, and I tend more on the national security, like American exceptionalism side. Um, the way I describe it is I'm a Reaganite, right? So I believe in the peace through strength, right? I believe that the world is a better place when America is leading the free world, right? And I think where isolationism, where it could sound nice in theory if, right, like if America retreated from the world stage and no other
Well, that's not
power.
what I'm advocating. You
Okay.
use that word, and I guess I've used it too, that I lean that way, but I'm not fully
Okay.
isolationist. Go ahead,
Yeah,
though.
and that's what we'll kind of we'll work out tonight here.
Hmm.
But what I would say is I what I think has happened, right? Because the right used to be like isolationism used to not be something on the right at all, and I think what happened is critical mistakes were made. For instance, in the war in Iraq, right? And that kind of get lumped in with anything America does now overseas, kind of gets lumped in with that mistake. Whereas, and this is why there's a guy that I really recommend people follow, Justin Stapley. He does, he, uh, he runs the
You
Freeman
have to
newsletter.
cut deals because
It's really good. And the thing I like about that is he distinguishes between the Bush doctrine and the Reagan doctrine, right? So when we kind of think of neoconservatives, right, and that's kind of this idea of we're going to go overseas to spread democracy and like regime change. That's actually quite different than Reagan's view, which is the one that I'm more of, where it's we're going to support our allies, right? We're going to support, we're going to be very prudential about how we use our power, but we're not going to shy away from using our power for the good in the world.
Yeah, okay. If you want to describe it that way, let me describe it my way, right? If I was the president of the United States, and I'm just going to pick anything, right? Any country, for example, that wants to be in our good graces, we're not just going to be sending them money unlimited. Like, I need their government to step up and to help fight the wars they want us to fight. For example, when we got into, well, with Libya, let's talk about Libya during the Reagan days, right? We were doing too much underhanded stuff behind the scenes, supporting rebels. That's how we got into more trouble. If I'm going to get involved, then I'm going to get involved more directly, but it's going to take a lot more drama for me to get involved in the first place. And so the way you describe the Reagan thing is they'll get involved behind the scenes, supporting rebels to kind of undermine the thing. But I think that's what makes it too messy. I'm more, if you're going to strike a blow, strike it quickly, decisively, and let the world know that we're running this show. But it's going to take a lot more for me to get involved. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is in other words, I'm actually maybe less on the side of like where possible, I want to avoid American troops on the ground if we can, right? And
Yeah.
so, I'm not saying as an absolute rule, sometimes they do need
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
on the ground, but no, I actually think the way it's not necessarily like obviously there's sometimes where you have to make a prudential choice to support this group or that group, but what I think the more general principle, and I think NATO is a good example of this, is we support, right? America leads through her alliances, through good relationships with other countries, right? And so that's where it goes, kind of the hot topics right now, Israel and Ukraine, right? In other words, and some people have called this, have compared this to the adventurism of Iraq or something, but they're actually not comparable at all, right? Ukraine and Israel are
Well,
countries.
let's put Israel on the side here for a bit. Let's just focus on Ukraine, because I think there are different factors when it comes to Israel. Let's just focus on Ukraine. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do think the issues are linked, but no. So when it comes to Ukraine, right, you have a country, a sovereign state that's an ally, right, of the West, that's friendly towards the West, and they want to rule their own country, right? And you have them invaded by Vladimir Putin, a guy who does have kind of ideas of Russian greatness and restoring, what he considers ancestral Russian lands. But the problem is the people in those lands don't want to be subjugated. And I think, and some people will, I think, straw man this issue, right? And they'll say that for those who support Ukraine, they want they want war with Russia, or they want American. Like, no, like, in other words, what we're doing in Ukraine, not a single American troop has been put in harm's way in Ukraine, right? The Ukrainian people, they're not asking us to come and fight on their behalf. They're perfectly willing to fight for their homeland. They're just asking for their allies, right? And to your other point, which I do think is a good one, and this is something that Trump has raised that I think is actually legitimate, is we do want our partners, right, in Europe and what's not, to pay more for their defense. And so when Trump came out and said that, that was a good thing. And what we've actually seen in Ukraine is Europe has started to step up. And now, well, until Speaker Johnson, what I think did the right thing, until then, America had kind of started to slack in that. And I think that is, in other words, when America can't be counted on to stand with its allies, that's when people like Putin, decide to get more aggressive. That's when I think Xi Jinping in China is carefully watching the Ukrainian situation to decide what he's going to do in Taiwan, right? In other words, and ultimately, I think a lot of this stems from the disastrous pullout in Afghanistan. I think Putin saw that and he's like, I don't think America's got the resolve to stand with their allies. And so he made the decision that he made.
And I think that's a good word that you use there, the resolve. And I think that's my position. If I was the president of the United States, the world would know that we have the resolve to get into whatever is in America's best interest. But there's a difference, for example, and I'm not saying the other countries are my children, but my children know when daddy is serious, he doesn't mess around. Like there isn't. And so I think with the Ukraine situation, we've kind of dilly-dallied around it at the beginning and kind of soft pedaled it. Either be yes, or be no, no. And I think I would have, as the president of the United States, I would have been stronger with Putin behind the scenes and make it clear to him that and like I said, I'm just saying if I agreed that he was in the wrong, that I would make it clear to him that don't get in this fight. And I'm letting you save face. But it would have to be, what's the word I'm looking for? It'd have to be something that I felt was crossing the line for me to get involved. You understand? So it's like, I don't want to get involved and I will wait till the last minute. But they would know beforehand, even in peace times, don't poke the bear because the bear will come strong. And I think this administration and others have been not wanting to offend somebody. I think the clearest way to avoid these type of conflicts is to be direct right away and let them know how far you're willing to go. Some people disagree with that, but I don't know your thoughts on that.
So I agree with you. You need to be clear that there will be consequences, but in the same token, right? You have to, if lines are crossed that you've set, right? You have to there has to actually be a consequence. Mm-hmm. And I think obviously, the Obama administration famously said, put a red line when in Syria with chemical weapon or with, certain kind of involvement, and the line was crossed and nothing happened. Right. And so mm-hmm. when people see that, they decide, you know what, maybe we're going to test them. And so strong words are good, but there needs to be the willingness to carry out on those words.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying, right? Make it clear at the beginning. Make it clear, and throw a big stick. Hey, Jennifer's joining us. Ready?
Oh, yep.
We're about to
Cool. So
switch topics here. Our guest has arrived. She must be fine and well. And let's go from there. Give me a second. Dr. Jennifer.
I'm
Glad.
coming. I'll be right
Yeah.
there.
I'm glad you're well,
sorry.
though. We weren't sure what was happening. And so we're glad you are fine and dandy and safe. And so we're glad to have you on the program. Joey, I'll continue this lecturing butt whipping some other time.
I am so sorry. I totally flaked out. I need like 2 minutes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Is that okay? Because this isn't
Yeah.
live, right?
Yes, it is. Oh, it's live. We'll put you on hold. Don't worry about it.
I'm so terrible. Hang on one sec.
So let's continue the conversation. Hold on. Give me a second here. All right, go ahead. So, yeah, where were you?
Yeah, so we were talking about willingness to follow through, and this this is one of the things where I think what's happening in corners of the right, there's this desire. I don't know if I want to call it a kind of fatigue, but I think there's I think there is a kind of fatigue with the idea of America as the world leader, right? In other words, we see our domestic problems, and I'm going to be the first one. I'm not going to deny that they're real, but like I was alluding to before, is there's a consequence of America, right? In other words, the most bloody periods are the periods of a world power, a major world power, a world hegemon receding, right? In other words, so you had what's called the Pax Britannica, right, which is the 19th century, where Britain ruled the sea, right? Britain basically kept the peace in Europe, right, and throughout its colonies around the world, and the world had relative peace. And then what you had happen at the end of the 19th century, you have the unification of Germany, right? Britain's power declining, and as that happens, what happens right now? All these other new rising powers, and then you get World War I, and you have Europe basically implode on itself, and then that's followed up with World War II, where Europe basically continued and just completely destroyed itself. And so America, right? If Americans decide, hey, we just want to retreat, that is going to have implications. And this is the other thing where I think sometimes people are a little disingenuous. They say, what does America's leadership in these places, what does that have to do with me personally and my family? And here's the thing, at the end of the day, sorry.
Yeah, let's get Jennifer back on here. We're glad you're safe. That's all that matters, Dr. Jennifer. And so we'll have this conversation.
I feel so terrible.
Nah, don't worry about it. We're all friends here, and so
foreign policy.
Yes, exactly. Which we're usually in agreement. We kind of slightly disagree. If we were both president, how we would attack foreign policy. All right, Joey, introduce the topic and our guest, and we can continue from here.
Yeah, so it's kind of a similar topic to the last time we had Dr. Schwirzer on, but since then, Matt, of course, continued in his bellicose way. But I actually was glad that Dr. Peterson took him up on the conversation, because I think it kind of nuanced some of the things that Matt had been saying. But I figured it would be great to have a conversation about it.
Okay. And Dr. Jennifer, if you can let the audience know your background, your expertise, so as we dive into some of these video clips, they can know that we're actually talking to a real professional and not just two knuckleheads.
Okay. I have 2 graduate degrees in psychology. one a master's in clinical counseling from Capella University, and another a doctoral degree in community counseling with a concentration in traumatology from Liberty University, and 15 years of clinical experience, and a lot more years than that of life experience.
Yes. And, sometimes we underestimate life experience. And when you pair that with your 2 graduate degrees, it really makes for a nice vacuum of a nice library, internal library of information to point these out. I remember watching, before we dive into the first clip, I remember watching this interview between Matt and Dr. Peterson, and I thought, usually I'm a big Jordan fan, but sometimes I thought that he was just speaking
gibberish.
Gibberish. Like he was.
So sometimes he doesn't. I don't even know.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he's communicating anymore. I think he's just musing in his own heads. And so hopefully, some of the things we see, you can break it down for us and like put it in layman's term. Not that I didn't understand what he was saying, but I don't think he was talking to the everyday person, of which this show is trying to get to. What do you think?
I would say Peterson overall is more of an academician, obviously, than Matt is. And I think Matt is very good at being blunt, and Peterson isn't as good he can be very blunt. But he's also, I think Matt just has such strong convictions about things. And I think Peterson is not as convicted. Like when Peterson talks about faith, to me, he loses me. And I love him. I feel like I'm watching him find God. I feel like he's sort of the pastor of the secular world right now. He's playing that role of like being sensible and reasonable and pastoral almost in the secular world of intellectuals. But I have like a solicitude for him as I watch him in this sort of transition process to where he can just say, Jesus is alive and Jesus saves, and he's not there yet. So when he starts talking about faith, I'm just kind of rolling my eyes thinking, dude, just have some conviction. We know you're smart. Show us you're convicted.
Speaking of which, though, I know a lot of people who know their Bible very well, yet they're not convicted. From your field of expertise, what's lacking? Like what doesn't, because from my field of expertise, obviously they just need to surrender to the Holy Spirit. But from a psychological standpoint, what are they missing? Because they believe these things, but it doesn't live out. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's all right. I've tried to describe conversion in common language or psychological language, and it always comes down to identity. And other thinkers have come to the same conclusion, that the person transitions from an identity that is separate from God to having an identity that aligns in some way with God. There's something that changes in how they identify themselves. And that's why I think the whole identity politics thing that's going on right now and invading the Christian church in very subtle Trojan horse type forms is very threatening, because it cuts to the heart of who we are as Christians. And as soon as people identify, they start to become what they identify with. There is a basic principle of human nature that we become what we think we are. And if people identify themselves as by their sex or by their sexual preferences or by their sin, really, they're setting up a sequelae of dynamics that are going to result in them conforming to those things, I think. If they, on the other hand, identify as someone who struggles with a certain sin or has a weakness in that area and is resisting it in the power and strength of God, that's different. So there's a subtle difference there. And I think it's very important that we make sure that we draw that distinction. Otherwise, we're setting people up to create a trajectory in their lives where they go straight into the very sins that they say they're trying to break away from.
Joey, jump in here.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, so I had sent Gio a few clips that had stuck out to me, but before I did you have any kind of overall...
Does not have that immediate cause, but my
discussion or between Matt and Jordan?
admittedly, I watched it a while ago, and I know it's going to come back to me as soon as I watch these clips. But I can't think of anything off the top of
Okay.
my head except that Matt Chandler. I'm sorry, Matt Chandler, not Matt Chandler. Matt, what's his last name?
Walsh.
Walsh.
Well,
Sorry about
Mm,
that. Because that guy just died. I mean, the
mm-hmm.
character. But
Yeah.
he, to me, his brand, he's a bit of a shock jock, and
Mm-hmm.
his brand is being blunt about things, and he's just overcorrecting. I get what he's correcting, and I
Mm-hmm.
want to go on record as a therapist that I'm not in favor of the thing that he's correcting, but I fear that now there will be an overcorrection. With Abigail Schreier's last book about children being overtreated, I don't want to go back to where it's somehow shameful to see a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, so
anyway,
it's a
that,
delicate balance. It's a
yeah.
delicate balance, no doubt. I remember when I was growing up, if you were seeing a therapist, you know, all they thought was straight jacket, have you wrapped up,
Crazy.
and yeah, sending you to Arkham Asylum or something, Joey.
You're nuts.
yeah. So I'd like to get your thoughts on this because I'm actually in the process of listening to Abigail's book right now. But the one thing that I feel like is could part of the balance be right. So in other words, let's not shame people who need to go to therapy, but then also let's not have like a therapist around every corner in the school, right? So in other words, there are kids who need to be in therapy and they shouldn't be shamed, but like that should be a decision that parents and medical professionals are making, right? Rather than the school system kind of just having them on background where, because, there's questions of even consent, right? Children can't give consent to things. And yet you have, there's times where they could be talking to a therapist in the school and the parents don't even know about it. And so maybe the balance is let's have like let's have doctors in doctors' offices and therapists in
Mhm.
counseling offices, and let's maybe leave the schools neutral, or I don't know.
I'm not super aware of what's going on in the schools right now. I remember my kids were in school. No, when I was in school, there was nothing like that. When my kids were in school, they needed more therapists, not fewer. To be honest, it was a Christian school, so they were probably a little more suspicious of secular psychology, but they needed more of that kind of thing rather than less. But you're speaking from your own observation, Joey, where
Well,
you've
yeah, this
seen.
wasn't my experience at school, but from what I've heard, I also went to a Christian school, but from what I've heard in a lot of public schools, right, where it's basically like kids can be going to a therapist right in school, right, that their parents have never don't even know about, right, which to me that
No.
seems kind of unethical because I mean I guess they probably signed something at the school year maybe, but
Yeah.
just the idea is informed consent, and if you have a child can't give informed consent without their parent, right? Their parent is the one who gives it. And so for me, I just feel like that's probably a line that like because a guidance counselor is one thing, but like giving actual therapeutic care, that's a different thing. And so I guess that's kind of where I'm skeptical. And then when I add on top of it the fact of all the stuff that we know schools are pumping in regards to gender. So if you have a therapist now that the parent doesn't know about, and that therapist is indoctrinated into gender theory, right? That just to me it just seems like there's a lot of problems there whereas it's not a problem with therapy in and of itself. But
Yes. The whole scenario where a child or even any client comes to someone with my credentialing, with my licensure, and that professional signs off on that person being taken from my office to immediately into a medical process as the magic bullet that's going to solve all their problems without treating the comorbid ADD, the autism, the anxiety, and all the other things that almost inevitably that person with gender dysphoria is dealing with. But instead they get escorted out from my office, and I sign off on that process. That's unheard of. What are therapists thinking that they're cooperating with this scenario? Why are we allowing our professionalism to be brought into such question? We're insulting ourselves by saying, you don't need us, you just need a surgery. or you need a bunch of medications and a surgery, and that's going to fix everything. We're insulting ourselves by doing that. But everybody's afraid to say anything, except people are starting to, some of them. The girls that have gotten beat up on basketball courts and had to see genitalia in their locker rooms and get beat up in prison, they're starting to talk. But so many of us have been just gobsmacked by what's going on that we're afraid to say anything because we don't want the shame of being accused of being transphobic or homophobic. And so we just sit and watch this happen. But I, as a therapist, won't take it sitting down. I think it's an insult to my profession.
You know, you mentioned that more and more people are talking, and I agree with you. You know, being on social media and things like that, I'm hearing more people being more vocal. But is anybody listening? Is the question. And I'm talking about, like, the president just passed something about Title IX that kind of undermines women's sports and women's the gains they've made for equality. Your thoughts on that? And then we'll dive into the first clip.
Yeah.
Joey?
It seems like in America, it's become such a tribal political issue, whereas in like Europe kind of ran down this path ahead of us. And like the UK, their largest gender clinic is shut down. I saw the UK's National Health Service has just come out with their guidance, like saying like no gender transition of anyone under 18, right? Netherlands, which was one of the first countries, I know they've stopped. And yet in America, it seems like it's become such a signal of like tribal identity to this political group that they're just going to run full steam ahead. So,
I mean, I've paid a price. I wrote a piece I sent out on the whole identity question, and my following is largely faith-based people that are interested in mental health. And so I was well within the realm of what I typically talk about. And I was talking about the assault on identity that I consider identity politics to be generally and gender identity politics to be specifically. And I had a loved one tell me to take them off my forwarding list. A very close loved one. Yeah.
Wow.
You put a target on your back. People interpret it. It's hard because people interpret it as cruelty, and that's the last thing on earth you want to be as a Christian, is a cruel person.
Yeah, but I guess cruelty's in the eye of the beholder, right? What you see as doing something lovingly, they may see as cruel, and it happened to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, kindest man in the world, and yet they crucified him for it. Let's go ahead and watch this first clip. Joey, let me know where you want me to stop it.
My point there, and this is where it gets pretty abstract, but I think it's kind of a misnomer to say that depression could ever not have a cause. Because I think that the human condition itself, the very fact that we are conscious beings operating in this world of death and misery, and we're living temporary lives, and we know it, and we're all going to die, and we know it, and that we have this awareness we are self-aware. We have this awareness of ourselves, which I think is what consciousness is. That alone is reason to feel despair, which is depression.
Right. Well, one of the things that you can derive from that is that the mystery isn't why people are depressed; it's why they're ever not depressed. And
exactly.
You can certainly say
that's kind of my view.
You can say the same thing about anxiety. I mean, your point there is that all cognizant mortal beings have sufficient reason for despair. Right. And yes, and I actually think that's true. I think the fact that we are able to live without paralyzing anxiety, because I think anxiety is probably the more germane response in the face of that kind of existential doubt. The fact that we're able to live in the absence of anxiety ever is a fundamental mystery. I also believe that psychologists who have their thoughts lined properly are much more concerned with the mystery of sanity than they are perplexed by the mystery of insanity. Now, it isn't obvious how we can live without anxiety. In fact, it's not obvious at all. And it's not obvious at all how it is that we structure our beliefs to
So we all
There he
laughed when,
goes. He's starting to go over the edge there.
yeah, we all laughed when he said that the thing is that how aren't we all living with anxiety?
The
What
mystery is
made
not why some people are depressed, it's why some people aren't.
yes? So why is that? Why did we laugh at that? Because I have my reasons for laughing at that. But go ahead.
Yeah, it just turns the question on its head, instead of it, everybody's always obsessing about the problems. And then Matt Walsh makes such a great point that, of course, people are going to be depressed. The world is a rotten place. We're all dying. This is a pretty bad situation. And then he says, yeah, so the mystery is not why are people sad, it's why people aren't. It was just logic, really.
Mm-hmm.
And it was funny logic, though, because it's not the way people typically think. They typically worry about the problem.
Mm-hmm. Joey, why'd you chuckle?
Yeah. So, and this is something where I'm on the fence, and like in other words, I resonate with Matt Walsh's view on depression, but like I don't know that I go all the way and believe like that I completely agree. Like I do think, listen, I know people who were helped by, for instance, limited use of antidepressants, right? And so Matt would say, well, it's all, and this is my problem with Matt. I think he points to something true, and then maybe takes it a little too far. But so, for instance, I do think where I agree with him is I think the fact that we have more people that are on drugs for depression, antidepressant drugs and stuff than ever before. And yet, by every metric, we're experiencing a mental health crisis. And I do think that there's a place where, listen, you take God out of a society, you take the communal structures like church and family, and you blow all that up, and you think you're going to fix it by giving people drugs. Like, I don't think that's going to work. I think we've over medicated people. But then on the flip side, right, if there's someone who, they're in the grips of something and they can be helped, be kept from suicide through a medical intervention, and I don't think I want to rule that out. So I guess how do we find that balance between what we have now and where we could have maybe a more sane approach?
I can just say from my own experience, the reason I got into counseling, the reason I got my kids grew up. I was always into music. I was a folk singer for many years. And then I started writing books about spiritual things. And, I loved writing. And then my kids grew up and they were ready to be without mommy. So I thought, yeah, I'd really like to do something on a professional level. And I was thinking about studying, going to the seminary because I really wanted to study theology. But the only job I would get out of that is a pastor. And I asked my husband if he wanted to be married to a pastor, and he said no. So I decided not to inflict that upon my marriage, and decided that actually counseling would fit well with my current life, where I would tour and do these things and be on the road, and then I could come home during the week and do counseling. So I ended up going for a master's degree in counseling. And then I got into a private practice because as soon as Adventists found out that someone that they knew was an Adventist was doing counseling, they came at me like moths to a flame. And pretty soon I had more clients than I could possibly carry, and I started giving them away and referring them to other people. Then we eventually named ourselves, and now I have over 50 people that we're referring to, and intake forms coming in every day. That's how much of a need there was in the Adventist community. It's not only Adventist clients, but it's largely Adventist clients, and it's kind of becoming the go-to place for online. We call it mental health coaching for legal reasons, but we have both licensed professionals and entry-level paraprofessional coaches working. So, this is my experience: is there was a great need. At the same time, I have had to fight to keep that balance between just good life principles in people's lives and pathologizing things that would be easy to correct if they would embrace those principles. And I've had to be really, really careful one of the things that really irritates me about therapists is they'll talk about therapy like it's some kind of exact process. It's almost like this esoteric thing that people come and they get this certain treatment that just fixes those things in ways that nothing else can. And I'll just tell you, with 15 years of clinical experience and 2 graduate degrees, that's a bunch of hogwash, to be honest with you. Yes, there are tools and there are things we can learn that will help people. And I love tools. I have a tools-based ministry. Abide Network is tools-based. We share tools with each other. I have a set of tools I give all of the coaches and all the people that come through. And I believe in tools and they can be helpful. But as far as there being some esoteric process that only the highly trained clinician can possibly impart to that, to me, that's just a bunch of baloney. Although I think that professional credentialing can help. So the original question you asked was, is there a place for therapy? That's essentially what the question that was on the table with Walsh and Peterson, right?
Yep.
Is there a place for it, and does it actually help people? And I would say, yeah, if it's done right, it can make a huge difference in people's lives. But it can also be much, to be honest with you. And to be fully honest, many times and I'll stop talking after this, in my clinical experience, I have thought, I'm not helping this person anymore, and they keep paying me to just complain, and I'm not helping them. And I'll be honest about that. And do I know exactly what to do in those cases? No, I don't. Sometimes I do say, you should try antidepressants. I'm not helping you.
Let me ask, the three of us coming from a faith-based perspective, how do we balance the notion that somebody can be helped with therapy, but knowing also that things are getting worse, and prophetically speaking, things are going to get worse? Jesus says that when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith in the earth? Because iniquity will abound, the love of many will grow cold. How do we balance that? Because I think, some of these people that Joey alluded to, that Matt alludes to, they're not really looking to get well. It's almost like they're just looking for a talking buddy, as you were alluding to. How do we balance that?
Yeah, I talk in the churches about mental health, and I will say, there's been a stigma and we need to lift the stigma. But I also say, and actually, the older generation has this stigma, but you may not be aware of this, but the younger generation on their social media apps are bragging about their mental health issues. They're not stigmatized at all. It's quite the opposite. So we've gone from one extreme to the other, and the truth is somewhere in the middle there. But I think that I love what Joey said about how the society is fully post-Christian. We have basically kicked God out, and all the principles that made our society great in the first place are getting kicked out along with it, along with religious liberty and freedom of speech and the basic freedoms that made us, that allowed the gospel to flourish. That's all getting canceled. And then think about it. There's a perfect storm going on here. You not only have the repudiation of the principles that stabilized our entire society and the individuals in it along with it, but you have people staring at screens all day. And Jonathan Haidt is doing a lot of work and he's not even a Christian or anything, but he's doing a lot of work about children and devices and how bad it is for them, but it's bad for adults too, to be on screens. I can feel it in my own life because I write and I'm on my computer, and I can just tell that screen time is wearing me down. And so you have this perfect storm of all these principles kind of being leached out of our great society, and then staring at screens, and the kind of social interactions that occur while people are looking at these screens are far less charitable than the kind of social interactions that screen time displaces. So people aren't talking to their neighbors as much anymore. They're talking to their screens. But the kinds of interaction, there's this thing called online disinhibition effect, where people are not nearly as nice to each other on social media applications as they are in real life. If you're actually face to face with that person, looking in their eyeballs. I just have my neighbors out here. They graze their sheep on my yard. And we love each other, but we only talk face to face, So you have that part of the perfect storm, the screen time and the polarization of society because of the way that people interact online. And then you have, everything else that's going on, and the proliferation of medications, and the proliferation of, I don't know, what other factors are happening that are contributing to this perfect storm that is making people mentally ill.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors. You think of, what they talk about, the red pill, blue pill culture, and people are losing hope. And I think that's part of that iniquity abounds comment, that people are losing hope in traditional values, thinking that they weren't good for the country, but it's actually their abandonment that has brought them to the place they are now. Let's check this next clip. Go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, I was just gonna say real quick on it. It's like, and this is where my skepticism of, like, this is where the more Matt Walsh side of me like speaks out. Is like, I've known people. Obviously, I'm not going to say names, but I've known people in my life who've gone to therapy for years, still do, and yet, like, they never get any better. And again, it's like, and Matt, I don't know if I clipped this, but Matt and Jordan, they talked about this, how people don't like being told what to do, so that's not going to fix it. But it's like, you can look at their life and you're like, you're inside all the time, right? You have no social life. You don't go to church. You don't eat well. You don't exercise. And yeah, you go to therapy once a week, but it's like, like maybe let's try some of the other things for a little bit. Like give it a 10-day try or something.
I'll tell you about therapy is that often if a person has like unresolved mental illness issues, they are going to rehearse their neuroticism, their anxiety, and their depression, and their sadness, and their grief. And they're going to rehearse those things, and they're going to reinforce those brain patterns, even with a therapist there, even if the therapist knows they're doing that damage, because it's not always possible to break into their thought cycles and reroute them. You can start to feel like you're trying to stop a freight train coming down the tracks. If people's negative feelings are powerful enough and they're fully committed to living in them, there's not a whole lot you can do. One thing that I've learned after 15 years of clinical practice is, with really negative clients, the clients that are really stuck in their negativity and not looking for help, they're not inclined to be open to input that I would give them, and they seem to just, I call them pay per vent clients. All they want to do is complain, and they pay me, and they're happy with that exchange. And I'll be honest, I've done it. I didn't know what else to do. But one of the things that I learned to do is say, hey, can we take just a break for a moment here? Tell me 3 things you're grateful for. Just to get their brain working a little differently. Yeah. Just tell me 3 things you're grateful for, just to get a little breather. You're talking about these problems, and I realize you really want to talk them through and you want to sort them out. I'm not trying to stop you from doing that, but can we just take a little breather from it, just so that you don't get overwhelmed with these negative feelings and thoughts? And just tell me what you're grateful for. And that's a tool that I wish I'd had earlier in the game, to be honest with you. Because you can do that in a very subtle way that isn't like, oh, you're just complaining. You're just being a baby. Exactly. You're wallowing in self-pity. Stop complaining and let's talk about how to fix it. That's not going to go over well. But like, hey, can we just take a little break here and tell me 3 things you're grateful for? I wish I'd thought of that earlier.
All right, let's see what Peterson has to say here.
Training was long and arduous and difficult. Not unpleasant, I would say. I enjoyed it a lot, but you had to develop a high level of conscientiousness to manage it. And so I would say it was often useful, and I watched my colleagues transform as they were trained and as they were called upon to offer counseling and develop strategies with their clients. I watched them mature and become more reliable and more awake and alert and wiser. And I would say for many people, having a consultant who can help you take apart the issues of your life, who can listen to you and can help you strategize, can be extremely useful. Now, that's balanced with the threat that there's nothing more dangerous than a loose cannon therapist. So, and one of your concerns, and one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation was because you were expressing concern that the therapeutic industry as such may now do more harm than good. And I would say,
Well, let me stop it there before
All
he
right, yeah.
continues. What do you think of that statement that he says that at this point he's concerned that the industry may be doing more harm than good?
Well, can I start a little earlier in what he
Yeah,
said?
go
Now,
ahead.
I agree with him that there is a place for having a consultant in your life, someone who advises you. And this is actually biblical. There's safety in a multitude of counselors. We see all the great leaders in Israel had counselors, and anybody in any kind of position of responsibility needs people to advise them. That's just good leadership, is what that is. Um, and that every life is difficult to manage and needs it's good to have two eyes on a problem to help you see all the angles of it. I have a person in my life that I talk to. I don't talk to them every week, but I can go to them and take stuff apart, and I get a lot of help from that person. It isn't a professional relationship where I pay them, but it is like that. It's very similar.
Mhm.
I believe in that. So I don't see therapy as always being a discrete process that has a beginning and an end and you get fixed. I see it as sometimes an ongoing thing, depending on the need of the person. And there are some people that don't have the basic supports in their life that a person needs to function well. For instance, someone who had a horrific family life and they come into adulthood and they have no parental support at all. That's that's a hit. That's a very difficult thing to cope with. And and yet it happens to people. And who are they going to turn to? Well, fortunately for the counseling industry, they can hire a counselor and sometimes they can form a good relationship with that person and it can be very helpful to them. It's sad that they have to pay the person and that it didn't come from someone that did it for free, but it's second best, but it's still helpful, I think. So I agree with him on that. But does the industry at large do more harm than good? That's a fair question. And I would say the direction that it's going right now, it is facilitating a lot of the really delusive things that are happening along the lines of identity politics. However, many times in my private practice, I have said to myself, I don't know how anybody can do this job and be a selfish person. To spend hours a day listening to other people's problems requires a certain kindness and compassion. I don't know how anybody can be a real hardcore narcissist and be a counselor. I really don't. Maybe they can, but maybe they're the type of counselor that just talks the whole time
Yeah.
and acts like a hero, and they can find a few suckers that'll pay them to do that.
Mercy.
Maybe. I'm serious, but
Hmm.
but if you're going to do it where you're actually listening to people, I don't know how you can be a malignantly selfish person and do that. It takes so much focusing on other people, which is the essence of unselfishness, is focusing on other people. And that's for want of which children aren't stable and humans feel lonely because nobody focuses on them ever. So to do that all day long is a huge act of compassion, whether you get paid for it or not. And so I have a hard time, even though the field is like 96% Democrat. So you could see where the political lean is. I have a hard time just relegating all of them to the trash heap of society because I know from experience you have to be a pretty good person to do the job.
Well, I
And
mean,
so,
I think people can do their jobs correctly regardless of political leanings, right? If they're staying professional in their capacity as a counselor, then that political leaning shouldn't necessarily jump out. Obviously, everybody, it'll ooze out some way, somehow, but it shouldn't jump out. Joey, you were going to jump in here a few seconds earlier. What's on your mind?
Yeah, no, so I was just going to say, I don't know necessarily if what Dr. Peterson was getting at is that there is ill will on behalf of certain therapists. But I think if and this is a question I've had, right? If you're dealing with somebody's mind, obviously, this is obviously intimately connected with spirituality and because all these things because we're holistic beings. And so if someone, even if they're completely well intentioned, but their worldview is such that they have a secular materialist worldview. They they agree with the gender identity things, right? They may well-intentioned believe the things they believe and have it, but can it be that worldview can lead to therapists that give bad advice or give bad interventions, right? In other words, so it's not necessarily that these are all a bunch of terrible, awful people, but Christianity, like the Christian worldview, is either true or it's not. The secular worldview is either true or it's not.
So one area in which the worldview will change the way you do therapy is a biblical worldview says, regardless of whether you're a victim or not, you're still accountable for what you do. The current worldview says if you are a victim, if you are one of the oppressed class, which is, to me, in a reductionist way, boiled down to race and gender and other identity markers in a very reductionist way. But anyway, if you're one of the oppressed class, then you are not responsible for what you do. That's a basic feature of critical theory that is, factored out into progressivism. So that's one way in which the biblical worldview is going to change the way you do therapy. Because me as a Christian therapist, I'm not just going to sit there and say, you poor little pumpkin. I'm going to sooner or later, but with a lot of empathy, surrounded with empathy, beginning with empathy, defaulting to empathy whenever I don't, that wokeism is basically reverse cognitive behavioral therapy because it emphasizes an external locus of control. Cognitive behavioral therapy says, what can you do about the way you feel as a result of what you're experiencing? What wokeism says is everything that happens to you happens out here. And that's why you have to change the out here and make it conform to whatever's going to make you feel better. And so that's a basic difference. And I'll give you an arena in which I see this happening in Christian circles. If the therapists are informed by this secular progressive worldview, they're going to believe every kid that comes to them and says that their parents were abusive. And it is very popular. It is very popular to claim your parents were abusive. If you want to get famous talk about the reverse stigma factor on TikTok and Instagram and social media, if you want to be famous overnight, claim that your parents abused you and now you're going to transition. I've seen it happen. I've seen kids get 10,000 followers overnight, and I have 400 followers on TikTok. By putting
and it's the power of suggestion,
victimhood.
Right? Of leading the immature mind, because as Joey was alluding to earlier, they don't have the ability to consent. And so their minds are malleable. And so you keep feeding that not only through these counselors who, like you said, Joey, don't have a proper worldview, but then society itself through the media, through TVs, through shows, through talk shows, social media. And a kid is bombarded that many kids, unfortunately, and I saw it growing up, not necessarily in this issue, but most kids just want to conform, get along to go along, or go along to get along. And so it's sad because now, unlike when I was growing up, the consequences, let's say, of transgender surgery or some sort of medical intervention has consequences that are more dire, more long lasting. We have another clip here. Let's watch this, and we'll go from there.
How do you think this changes? Is it a lot of this sort of gender-based? I was when I was arguing about the therapy thing on Twitter, and I got into a back and forth with Lauren Southern, who's another conservative personality, I guess. And I like her. She gets a little mad at me sometimes when I do my whole harsh internet dad routine. But after we went back and forth about it, she said something I thought was interesting.
That's not good if Lauren Southern gets mad at you, because she's pretty harsh in her own right. So if you're treading on Lauren Southern's feelings, that's quite something.
That's true.
Anyways.
That's true. It takes some effort on my part. It takes some effort. But she made a point at the end of it that I thought was interesting, which is that she said, a lot of our differences on this topic is probably man brain versus woman brain. So on therapy, is there something to be said for the fact that is therapy in general more useful as a general statement, maybe for women than it is for men? Or is it a totally different kind of therapy that men need, or how does that factor into it?
That's a good question. Well, women.
Before he tackles that question, and I don't know how far you wanted to go with that, Joey. Give me a second. 1 second, real quick. Okay. Just wanted to get you on your solo screen. How would you answer that question before we hear from Dr. Peterson? Is there a difference between how you treat a man and a woman, or a woman therapist versus a male therapist? I mean, there's got to be some differences. We are created differently, but I think both can do good.
Yeah. Are you asking me?
Yes.
Okay. So I think therapy would help men just as much if they would go. They won't go. Men are much less likely, much more reluctant to ask for help generally, thus the joke about asking directions. And men tend to develop more of a competitive power struggle kind of dynamic with people. I currently have a situation where I was desperate to help a marriage, and I wrote a letter to the husband about what he was doing to destroy his marriage, and he won't speak to me now. So, they don't like hearing from women, and they don't like hearing strong language from women, but you have to say things sometimes to be an honest person. So I would say overall, there is more resistance from men for getting help generally, but especially getting help from women. Okay. But I think if they went, they would get as much or more benefit from it. Although I would say overall, men will probably want that discrete process. They'll do one of two things. They'll come to you occasionally for problem-oriented things. You'll talk it through and it'll be over until they come back around to another problem. Or they will stay with you for a discrete amount of time, maybe 12 sessions, and then they'll be done. Mm-hmm. More than women who will tend to want to just talk to you every week for the rest of your life.
And would you say that men would prefer a male therapist, or would they prefer a female therapist? What has been your experience?
I've gotten both. I would say that overall, if it's a male problem, like something with pornography, or although I've had a number of male clients with pornography addiction, and I don't shy away from that kind of thing, or I'm not afraid of it. And I don't think it's ineffective either necessarily. And I ask pretty blunt questions, pretty graphic, blunt questions that I have to ask if I'm going to get a read on what was going on in the person's life. But I'm past being embarrassed about anything at this point in my life. But I am, like, nothing shocks me anymore. But I would say overall, we try with the Bide Network, we try to put guys with guys if they're going to talk about those, guy type issues overall. And that guys tend to want a male therapist, but I'd say maybe it's like 60-40. Okay. 40% women, they're fine with a woman, or they want a woman sometimes, and 60% they want a guy.
Yes. Okay. Let's see go ahead, Joey.
I just have to say, this whole conversation about men in therapy reminds me of one of my favorite shows, The Sopranos. Tony Soprano, the mob boss, he starts every episode with his therapist, and then it's like where he's describing like the murders he just did that day as a mob. I'm sorry, I digress though. That's what came to my mind.
And then he fell in love with his therapist.
Yeah, toward the end.
Yeah, toward the end.
Yeah, never watched The Sopranos, so yeah. I've heard of it, because actually some of the places where it was filmed, I grew up in. I grew up in New Jersey, in Secaucus and all that area. Yeah, so let's see how Dr. Peterson answered that.
Men are characterized by higher average levels of negative emotion. So one of the ways of conceptualizing that is that per unit of threat and punishment, women will suffer more than men. And there is a variety of reasons for that, but I think the most fundamental reason is likely that women are wired more than men to respond to distress of infants particularly, and that gives them a general proclivity to respond to distress. And Now, the upside of that is, well, infants don't die. The downside of that is women suffer from higher levels of depression and anxiety. And that's true cross-culturally, and it's more true in gender equal countries. So it looks like it's deep difference. Women are also more people and relationship oriented than men. And that's actually the biggest difference we know between men and women. Women are reliably more interested in people than they are in things. Most people who incline in the therapeutic direction are female or have a relatively feminine temperament. And there are aspects of my temperament, for example, that are quite feminine. So I'm quite high in trait agreeableness, for example, like quite spectacularly high, actually. And that's a more feminine trait because women are also more agreeable than men. So I would say that listening ear mentality rather than that concrete problem solving mentality is more feminine than it is masculine. Now, there are more masculine approaches to therapy, like the behavioral approaches are, I would say, more temperamentally masculine. They're a lot more problem focused. It's like, what the hell's your problem? No, I'm
There was a lot of things he was saying that
that
you
was
were
good.
agreeing with. So
Yeah.
let's hear him from your
I
perspective.
want to say this really quick. Do you guys know Nick Freitas? He's on Instagram. I don't know if he's on
Yes,
Twitter.
yes.
He's so funny and he's brilliant. And I follow him on Instagram, and he just did a post on how he with his wife has learned how to be a reflective listener, how to be an empathic listener. And then he said the same thing Ben Shapiro said, is it's helpful if she tells him whether she needs just empathy or she actually wants him to help solve the
Fix it.
problem.
Yeah.
If she flags it, just empathy, please, then he just listens. And he's learned that when he does that, and this is remarkable coming from him because he's a man's man, he's a manny man, and and he's a real conservative thinker and all that, and loves his guns, and his meat. So he's not a flower child here. But he said that he finds that when you do engage in that empathic listening, that the person then will correct themselves and will be more problem solving of themselves when they have someone just listening. And so that's the power of empathic listening. But I agree with Peterson that women are more naturally inclined to that. They're more joiners and empathizers, and men are more problem solvers. And in a therapist, you need both, really. But if you don't have the empathy piece, the problem solving ain't going to happen in most cases. So I think that was what and he said a lot of things about women having more trait agreeableness, and women overall being more set up to respond to distress. And there's a number of reasons why women are more inclined toward depression. They're twice as likely to develop depression, twice as likely to have anxiety, twice as likely to have PTSD, 3 times as likely to attempt suicide, but men are 3 times as likely to succeed at suicide. There's a bunch of stats like that. I like to say it this way, that because I think men do have negative emotion, and it's called anger. So women are more likely to act inward and end up in therapy, and men are more likely to act outward and end up in jail. That's the
Which
way
is
I
why
see it.
most mass shooters tend to be male. Not that.
Or women on testosterone.
Yeah. Joey, you were going to say?
Well, this episode may not stay on YouTube. No, it's unstable. No, but no. So what I was saying. So could this be another area where a worldview difference could create problems in therapy? Right. In other words, in not acknowledging the inherent differences between the sexes. Right. There can be one size fits all thing to therapy, whereas maybe they do need different approaches. Maybe, but like I just know when I've, had certain issues or whatever, like I'll say to one of my female friends, like, yeah, I just need to go with one of my buddies and shoot something in the woods. Right. And to them, they're like, what? That reels back. You gotta what? I'm like, you don't understand. That's just what guys with their buddies shooting things. But if we don't acknowledge, right, in the therapeutic process that men and women are fundamentally different, right, which is again in our kind of ultra egalitarian age, right, where that's been defined as same, right, that I could see that causing some of the confusion around this topic. But I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
I love Paul's counsel for wives to respect and husbands to love. It's gotten a lot of blowback from the feminists, and it's been abused actually and made to mean things that it doesn't really mean. So it's been overplayed by certain, I would say, patriarchalist or maybe toxic patriarchalist Christian expositors. And that is to some degree contributed to the blowback against it. But I like that counsel. And I think what God is doing there is giving women a language that works better with their husbands. I have broken this all down. Let me just try to make it really simple. Men are more inclined toward avoidant attachment styles, afraid of losing their individuality. Women are more inclined toward anxious attachment styles, afraid of losing the relationship. I think what Paul is doing there is giving women a language to use with men that will make them feel less afraid of losing their individuality. Respect language does that. If I let you know that I respect who you are, I'm not going to violate your, sort of title and your position. I'm going to let you be your kind of walled off boundaried self.
Yeah.
I'm not going to intrude upon that. And I treat you with respect. You're going to feel much more comfortable with me and much less inclined to be afraid that I'm going to somehow glom onto you and take away your individuality. If on the other hand, I'm afraid of losing that relationship and someone talks to me in love language, it's offsetting my most fundamental fear. And so I think what God was doing there is giving language to husbands and wives. And I find that it works in the general realm. Like I remind myself often, talk to him in respect language. It'll work better than if you mother him.
Yes. I mean, yes. Amen, sister. When I was picking my wife, two things, overarching themes. I needed some clarity, obviously, and we got to know each other. But overarching theme was, one, I didn't want a mother because I'm a grown man. And two, I didn't want to finish raising a daughter, right? So I wanted a woman who was my equal, not somebody that I had to finish raising. And so early on in our conversation with my wife, I saw that she was an independent woman. And so not somebody I needed to. So that notion that you just brought out is spot on. As we wrap up, because Joey and I have another show to do at the top of the hour, how does a person, male or female, in your estimation, how do they come to decide whether they should seek professional help? Like, what's perhaps a tall tale sign that perhaps this is beyond and maybe you should seek some professional help?
Yeah, and maybe I'll be showing my, colors as a licensed therapist here, but I do think that the DSM and the whole system does serve a function in society. And if we completely avoid it like it's some kind of satanic trap, then we're not really availing ourselves of something that can be very helpful at times. So I would say that all the diagnoses, for instance, of anxiety and depression, let's just take those two because those are the most common ones. Something like 60% of people will have anxiety and or depression at some point in their lifetime. That is the two most common disorders that people in my position see on a regular basis, is anxiety and depression. So the distinguishing factor of anxiety and depression is that it makes it impossible for that person to function. They can't work, they can't function physically, or they're not themselves. They're not able to love. They're not able to work. They're not able to basically fulfill the duties of being a human being. And there are, of course, high functioning forms of anxiety and depression, but there will be something that will give sooner or later. And if that person's sadness or their anxiety is so significant that they find that they're not able to be their best selves and love as effectively and work as effectively and serve as effectively as they could, if they didn't have those things, then they should see someone that knows something about how to resolve those things. And there are tools that actually work. I'm a living proof of that. I used to have clinical depression. And the point where it turned around for me was when I was studying psychology in a secular program, Christian talking here, and I love the Bible, but all that studying secular psychology showed me was things that were in the Word all along, but I had just not seen them. And it took studying the secular to take the scales off my eyes to where I realized, oh, that's what that casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself. We're supposed to deal with our own negative thoughts, and we're supposed to cast them down. It takes a certain amount of oomph to get rid of old, wired in, established thought patterns, but we're to cast them down and bring them into obedience to Christ, who is the truth. So if you think something that's untrue, then you need to deal with that. And when you change your thoughts, your feelings tend to follow. All of that was in inspired writings, but I didn't see it until I saw it in the scientific literature. And then when I started embracing those things, I improved. So my point is just that someone in my position that has the experience and training that I have can show people how that works. And, we give tools, cognitive behavioral tools, dialectical behavior tools, grounding tools, trauma processing tools that help people actually resolve some of these problems and get back up to functioning again. But I'll tell you one more thing, and that is that a lot of why Abide Network is able to help people is because we have been able to form a mental health community. And I think the clients get as much, if not more, out of being connected to the community. We have a once a week Bible study, and we have all these support groups and things going on. Though people start connecting to that community, there is something in that sauce that helps them,
Yes.
I think, even more than the counseling, but then the counseling helps too.
In a similar standpoint, when I was losing the weight I lost and now I'm as fit as I've ever been in my life, it was being part of a fitness community that really inspired and really kept me going till now. It's ingrained, and it's what I call termination phase or maintenance phase, where now the habit of exercising is ingrained. Joey, one last thought, and then we'll have our guest leave us with a short closing thought.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say, I think what you were saying there is the key, right? Because, in other words, some people want to talk about, like, well, is therapy going to work, or do people just need to go back to church, but I think the key is in the fact that it's all of the above, right? In other words, the reason why we're so disconnected and we have so much anxiety and just existential angst is because we've lost the guardrails in a society, right? People don't have that community that they used to have at church. And so, yes, maybe therapy can help, right, people deal with these things, but really what they need, and that's like what you guys have at Abide, they need that community that we've lost as a society. And so it's not a this or, it's and, right? It's and this. So I like that.
All right. Close us off, Jennifer, with the final thought on what Joey said or whatever. And where can people connect with you?
All they have to do is go to abide.network. That is the webpage, and they should just click around and look at all that we have to offer. There's just so much going on at this point. The Lord has really built it up. And yes, to the community factor, there was a certain point in the whole process where I said to myself, I've been telling people to go find community for years, but let's create community so that we can say, here it is. And that actually happened during COVID. We started that Bible study during COVID. We still have 50 to 70 people coming every Friday night. So, but I want to say this to both of you. I love you, and both of you are an inspiration to me. Joey, you're so knowledgeable about government and politics. I just read your tweets and go, wow, he knows so much. And Gio, I don't see you.
That's the only reaction I get. So
What's that?
I said that's not the only reaction I get.
I know.
So I'm glad that.
But you have. I don't even understand half of the things you write, so I don't really have an opinion. But you are very knowledgeable, and Gio, you're such a blessing, and I really appreciate what you guys are doing for the church and for the world. And I have really high hopes and big dreams for both of you. I want you to know that.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we thank you for being on. We're glad you're safe, and we'll do it again sometime. Until next time, folks, thank you for the Gio and Joey show and our guest, Dr. Jennifer. Be blessed.